Welcome back, Midnight Stories family. Get ready for another heart-touching tale. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now let's dive into today's story. The soft hum of violin strings drifted through the air as James sat across from his wife, Eleanor, in the dimly lit restaurant. The warm, golden glow of candlelight reflected off the crystal glasses filled with vintage wine, painting a picture of timeless romance. It was their 30th wedding anniversary, a milestone that James had been counting down to for months. Yet, as he gazed into Eleanor's eyes, he couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. Eleanor's laughter seemed forced, her eyes darting away whenever James tried to hold her gaze. She reached for her phone multiple times throughout the evening, her thumb hovering over the screen as if she were weighing a decision. The shrill ping of an incoming text message broke the fragile silence between them. Eleanor flinched, hurriedly tucking her phone beneath the napkin on her lap. "Everything okay?" James asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "Of course," she replied too quickly, her smile betraying a flicker of unease. "It's just work stuff." James nodded, but doubt lingered. Eleanor hadn't worked late in years. She'd stepped away from her high-pressure corporate career to focus on writing a memoir, a dream she'd talked about since their early years together. Tonight, however, her demeanor screamed distraction. She was present physically, but her mind was somewhere far away. As the evening progressed, James noticed other peculiarities. Eleanor excused herself twice to take calls in the ladies' room. When she returned, she avoided mentioning the calls, brushing off his inquiries with vague answers. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass, spilling a few drops of wine onto the white tablecloth. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate crème brûlée with caramelized sugar, James's stomach churned with unease. His wife's glowing smile and playful banter felt rehearsed, like an actor delivering lines from a script. Then, as she reached for her phone once more, a notification briefly lit up the screen. A single name flashed before disappearing into the void. Oliver? The color drained from James's face. Oliver wasn't a name he recognized. It wasn't a coworker or a mutual friend. Questions swirled in his mind, each more troubling than the last. Why hadn't she mentioned this person before? What was she hiding? "Eleanor, who's Oliver?" James asked, his voice low but firm. Eleanor froze, her fork poised mid-air. For a moment she didn't answer, her eyes flickering with an emotion James couldn't quite decipher. Fear, guilt, or something else entirely. Then she laughed softly, almost dismissively. "Just a colleague," she said, brushing her hair over her shoulder. "Nothing important." But James wasn't convinced. The evening ended with a tense ride home, the air in the car thick with unspoken words. As Eleanor disappeared into the bathroom to prepare for bed, James remained in the living room, clutching her phone. He had one chance to unlock the truth, but as he swiped the screen, the device demanded a passcode, a new one Eleanor had set without telling him. His heart pounded in his chest. Something was wrong. And James was determined to find out what. James sat alone in the quiet living room, the weight of 30 years pressing heavily on his chest. The soft glow of the table lamp illuminated the wedding photo on the mantel, a younger version of himself and Eleanor, beaming with the uncontainable joy of new beginnings. Their love story had been the kind people envied, or so he thought. They had met in the most unexpected of places, a crowded college library during exam week. James was struggling to understand a textbook on economics when a loud sigh caught his attention. Across the table sat Eleanor, her raven-black hair cascading over her face as she scribbled furiously in her notebook. He had offered her a sheepish smile, only to accidentally spill his coffee across her notes moments later. Her glare had been sharp, but her wit sharper. That coffee spill turned into a conversation, and then into a series of late-night study sessions. Eleanor wasn't just beautiful, she was ambitious, intelligent, and refreshingly honest. It wasn't long before James found himself falling for her, and by their third year, they were inseparable. Their shared dreams of a future filled with love and success gave them the drive to face life's challenges head-on. The early years of marriage were far from perfect but filled with resilience and determination. Their first apartment was a cramped studio with peeling wallpaper and a perpetually leaky faucet. They ate instant noodles more nights than they cared to admit, laughed over small victories like paying off a utility bill on time, and clung to each other during moments of despair, like when Eleanor suffered a miscarriage early in their marriage. The pain was immense, but they faced it together, promising to cherish each other even more deeply. When Sophie and Michael arrived, their world transformed. Eleanor, ever the multitasker, somehow balanced a demanding corporate career with being a devoted mother. She became the epitome of grace under pressure, attending board meetings by day and reading bedtime stories by night. James often marveled at her ability to juggle so much without losing her warmth or sense of humor. But life wasn't without its strains. As James threw himself into his work to provide for their growing family, he unknowingly began to pull away from Eleanor. Their conversations shifted from dreams and ambitions to logistical discussions about school schedules, bills, and repairs. The romance that had once been the heart of their relationship became an occasional afterthought, a date night here, an anniversary dinner there. Eleanor's decision to leave her corporate job came as a surprise. She explained it as a need to prioritize herself after years of putting her career and family first. James supported her wholeheartedly, even converting the attic into a bright, inviting writing space. She spoke passionately about her plans to write a memoir, a project she had dreamed of since their college days. For a time, it seemed like the decision had rekindled Eleanor's spark. She would spend hours in her writing studio, emerging with pages filled with vivid stories from her past. James loved hearing her recount memories of their early days, though he couldn't help but notice that some of her stories seemed to focus more on her individual accomplishments than their shared ones. As time went on, Eleanor's enthusiasm for writing seemed to fade. The studio that had once been her sanctuary grew eerily quiet. She started spending more time on her phone, her screen lighting up with messages she rarely shared. When James would ask about her progress, she'd smile faintly and say, "I'm just taking a break, rethinking my approach." Subtle changes began to accumulate. Eleanor's wardrobe shifted from comfortable sweaters and jeans to tailored dresses and designer heels. She started going to the gym, something she hadn't done in years. At first, James thought she was rediscovering her confidence, a sign of her determination to embrace this new chapter in her life. But then came the late nights out, the cryptic texts, and the guarded expression she wore whenever he walked into the room unannounced. A week before their anniversary dinner, James found himself standing in the laundry room, folding Eleanor's clothes. As he reached for a blouse, a faint but unfamiliar scent lingered, a musky cologne that wasn't his. His stomach churned, but he pushed the thought aside, convincing himself it was probably from a casual hug at the gym or a crowded cafe. Deep down, though, a seed of doubt had been planted. That doubt grew into suspicion during the anniversary dinner. Eleanor's laughter felt rehearsed, her compliments hollow. And then there was the text from Oliver. A single name, yet it carried the weight of an entire history James didn't know. Who was Oliver? A friend, a confidant, or something more? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, picking at the carcass of their once solid trust. James began to reflect on the times he might have failed Eleanor. He remembered the nights he stayed late at the office, the times he was too tired to engage in meaningful conversation, the occasions he brushed off her feelings because he assumed she would always understand. Was this her way of retaliating? Or had they simply grown apart, blind to the widening gap until it was too late? But this wasn't just about Eleanor's behavior. It was about the life they had built together, the promises they had made, and the family they had nurtured. If there was a chance to salvage what remained, James needed the truth. Not half-truths or evasions, but the full, unvarnished reality. As he sat in the dim light of the living room, Eleanor's phone lay on the coffee table like a forbidden artifact. He reached for it, his hand trembling, but stopped short. Whatever answers the phone held, he wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. Instead, he set it down, resolved to uncover the truth on his own terms. Upstairs, the sound of running water stopped. James knew Eleanor would emerge soon, ready to slip into bed beside him as if nothing were amiss. But for James, everything had changed. The anniversary that should have been a celebration of their love felt like the beginning of an unraveling. Tomorrow, James thought. Tomorrow I'll find the truth. The early morning sunlight filtered through the half-open blinds, casting streaks of golden light across the bedroom floor. James lay on his side of the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. Eleanor's soft breathing filled the room, a rhythm that had once been comforting but now felt foreign. The events of the previous evening, her evasive responses, the text from Oliver, and her distant demeanor, played on a loop in his mind. He turned his head slightly to observe her. She lay curled up, her face peaceful and serene as if she had nothing to hide. But James couldn't shake the feeling that her tranquility was a mask, a facade concealing something far more troubling. His stomach churned with unease. As Eleanor stirred and stretched, her eyes fluttered open. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," James replied, forcing a smile. He hoped she couldn't detect the tension simmering beneath his composed exterior. Eleanor slipped out of bed, wrapping herself in a satin robe. "I'll make us some coffee," she said, disappearing down the hallway. James watched her go, his mind racing. The name Oliver echoed in his thoughts like a bell tolling a warning. He had never been the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but the evidence, though circumstantial, was mounting. He needed to understand what was happening, and he needed to do it carefully. As he descended the stairs, he saw Eleanor standing by the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone with a faint smile. The sight made his heart ache. He had seen that smile countless times before, but now it felt like it wasn't his to claim. Who's Oliver? The question hovered on the edge of his lips, but he swallowed it back. Confronting her now would be premature. He needed more than a gut feeling, he needed proof. Eleanor handed him a steaming cup of coffee, her expression as cheerful as ever. "What's on your agenda today?" she asked casually. "Just a couple of meetings," James replied, his tone nonchalant. "What about you?" "Not much," she said, taking a sip from her mug. "I might work on the memoir for a bit and then head to the gym." James nodded, but his mind was already dissecting her words. The gym had become a new fixture in her routine over the past 6 months, coinciding with the other changes in her behavior. Her renewed focus on fitness had initially seemed like a positive shift, but now it felt like part of a larger puzzle he couldn't yet solve. Later that day, while Eleanor was out, James found himself standing in her writing studio. The small room was cluttered with notebooks, printed drafts, and empty coffee cups. The air smelled faintly of lavender, a scent she often used to create what she called her creative atmosphere. But as he looked around, he noticed something strange. The laptop on her desk was closed, its charging cable disconnected and neatly coiled. Eleanor had always been particular about keeping her laptop plugged in, especially when she was in the middle of a project. The sight of it sitting idle struck him as odd. His curiosity got the better of him, and he opened the device, only to be met with a login screen requiring a password. James frowned. Eleanor had never been secretive about her passwords before. They had shared everything, bank accounts, calendars, even social media logins. But now, as he stared at the blank password field, it felt like an invisible wall had been erected between them. He closed the laptop and left the studio, a gnawing sense of unease following him like a shadow. The next few days passed in a haze of half-truths and careful observations. James began to notice more inconsistencies in Eleanor's behavior. She would leave the room to take phone calls, her voice hushed and her tone clipped. Her gym visits grew longer, and she started coming home with excuses that didn't quite add up. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Eleanor's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening for a split second before she grabbed the device and placed it face down. James's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yeah," she replied quickly, her smile a little too forced. "Just a message from the book club." James nodded, pretending to accept her explanation. But deep down he knew she was lying. Eleanor hadn't mentioned her book club in weeks, and the last time she attended a meeting, she had come home early, claiming the discussion had been dull. Determined to uncover the truth, James began paying closer attention to the details Eleanor seemed to overlook. He memorized her gym schedule, noted the time she received texts, and even observed the subtle shifts in her mood whenever her phone buzzed. One morning, while Eleanor was in the shower, James noticed her gym bag sitting by the door. The zipper was partially open, revealing a neatly folded towel and a water bottle. But something else caught his eye, a receipt sticking out of the side pocket. He pulled it out, his hands trembling slightly. The receipt was from a high-end cafe across town, dated 2 days earlier at a time when Eleanor had claimed to be at the gym. James's heart sank. The cafe wasn't on the way to the gym, nor was it a place they frequented together. He imagined her sitting at a table with someone, laughing and sharing intimate moments while he was at work, oblivious to her betrayal. The discovery fueled his resolve. He couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed to gather more evidence, to piece together the fragments of her secret life before he could demand answers. That night, as Eleanor slept beside him, James lay awake, formulating a plan. He would follow her the next time she went to the gym, track her movements, and uncover the truth once and for all. His heart ached at the thought of what he might find, but he knew he couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. For now, he would play the role of the trusting husband, hiding his suspicions behind a mask of normalcy. But beneath the surface, he was a man on a mission, determined to uncover the secrets that threatened to destroy the life they had built together. The day James chose to uncover the truth felt ordinary in every outward sense. The sun was shining, Eleanor hummed softly in the kitchen as she packed her gym bag, and the world outside bustled with its usual rhythm. But for James, everything felt charged with an electric tension, his resolve solidifying with each passing minute. He had spent the previous night preparing, his mind a whirlwind of questions. What was Eleanor hiding? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, why? The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on his chest, but he knew that today would be the day he took the first real step toward finding answers. As Eleanor kissed him on the cheek and waved goodbye, gym bag slung casually over her shoulder, James forced a smile. "Have a good workout," he said, his tone steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, he sprang into action. Grabbing his coat and keys, he followed her at a careful distance, ensuring he remained unseen. His heart pounded as he watched her car pull out of the driveway and head toward the gym, or so she had claimed. At first, the drive seemed uneventful. Eleanor took the familiar route toward the fitness center, but halfway there she made an unexpected turn. James frowned, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he maintained a safe distance. She wasn't heading to the gym. Instead, her car pulled into the parking lot of a small, upscale cafe, the same one listed on the receipt he had found in her gym bag days earlier. James parked a few spaces away, his mind racing. He watched as Eleanor stepped out of the car, her posture confident and relaxed, and walked toward the cafe entrance. Moments later, a man emerged from the building to greet her. He was tall, with an athletic build and a smile that radiated warmth. Eleanor's face lit up as she hugged him, a gesture that felt far too intimate for comfort. James felt his chest tighten, his breath hitching in his throat. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding before him. The man held the door open for Eleanor and they disappeared inside together. For a moment, James sat frozen in his car, the gravity of the situation sinking in. His worst fears were being confirmed, piece by agonizing piece. Determined to learn more, he stepped out of his car and entered the cafe, keeping a low profile. The cozy interior was bustling with patrons, but James's eyes immediately found Eleanor and the man seated in a corner booth. They were leaning in close, their expressions animated as they spoke. Eleanor laughed, her hand brushing lightly against the man's arm. It was a version of her James hadn't seen in years, carefree, engaged, and alive. He chose a seat a few tables away, his back turned to them but his ears straining to catch fragments of their conversation. The noise of the cafe made it difficult, but he managed to pick up enough to deepen his suspicions. Words like "last week" and "next time" floated to him, hinting at an ongoing relationship. As he sat there, grappling with the enormity of what he was witnessing, Eleanor's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and quickly swiped it away, a nervous gesture that didn't go unnoticed by her companion. James couldn't see the message, but her reaction was telling. It was clear she was hiding something even from this man. After what felt like an eternity, Eleanor and her companion stood to leave. James quickly exited the cafe ahead of them, positioning himself in his car just in time to watch them say their goodbyes. The man placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, his thumb grazing her collarbone in a way that felt deeply personal. She smiled, then turned and walked back to her car, her expression serene. James followed her home, his mind reeling. He felt like a stranger in his own life, the foundation of his marriage cracking beneath him. Back at the house, Eleanor greeted him with her usual warmth, as if nothing had happened. The dissonance was jarring and James struggled to maintain his composure. That evening, while Eleanor showered, James seized the opportunity to dig deeper. He retrieved her laptop from the writing studio, hoping to uncover more evidence. After several failed attempts to guess the password, he finally remembered a phrase she had once mentioned, a line from her favorite poem. To his shock, it worked. Her inbox was a treasure trove of confirmation and heartbreak. Emails from Oliver were frequent, their tone casual yet laced with undertones of intimacy. They referenced meetings at the cafe, shared jokes, and even future plans. One particular email made James's stomach churn, a confirmation for a weekend getaway at a secluded resort, booked for the following month. The messages painted a picture of a relationship that had moved far beyond friendship. James's hands trembled as he scrolled through them, the words blurring together as his emotions overwhelmed him. Anger, betrayal, sadness. They all collided, leaving him in a state of stunned disbelief. By the time Eleanor emerged from the bathroom, James had returned the laptop to its original place. She smiled at him, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. "What's on your mind?" she asked, slipping into bed beside him. "Nothing," James replied, his voice hollow. "Just work." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. The truth was out, and James knew there was no turning back. He couldn't confront her yet, not without a plan. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also ignited a resolve he hadn't felt in years. He would take action, but on his terms and in a way that ensured justice. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep, James stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities. The days ahead would be difficult, but one thing was certain. He would uncover every last piece of the truth, no matter the cost. The dining room felt like the center of a brewing storm. James had spent hours preparing for this moment, replaying different scenarios in his mind. The table was set meticulously, just as Eleanor liked it: fine china, polished silverware, and a bottle of her favorite red wine. It was ironic, really, to create an air of celebration for what he knew would be the most painful confrontation of their lives. Eleanor entered the room carrying a dish of roasted vegetables. She looked radiant, almost carefree, wearing a navy blue dress that James hadn't seen before. Her hair was styled neatly, and her perfume, a subtle floral scent, wafted through the air as she set the dish on the table. "You've outdone yourself tonight," she said with a smile, glancing at the meal James had prepared. Her tone was light, even playful, as though they were just another happy couple sharing a quiet evening together. James forced a smile, his heart pounding in his chest. "It felt like a good night for something special," he replied, his voice calm but devoid of warmth. They sat down to eat, the clinking of utensils against plates filling the silence between them. Eleanor talked about her day, her trip to the gym, running into an old friend, and an idea she'd had for her memoir. James nodded along, pretending to listen, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the evidence he had uncovered and the words he had rehearsed. Finally he set his fork down, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Eleanor," he began, his voice steady but heavy with intent. "There's something we need to discuss." Eleanor looked up, her smile faltering. "What is it?" James leaned back in his chair, studying her face. For a moment he said nothing, letting the tension build. "Who is Oliver?" he asked, his tone calm but unyielding. Eleanor froze. Her hand, which had been reaching for her wine glass, hovered in midair before retreating to her lap. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James didn't look away. "Don't play dumb, Eleanor. I know you've been seeing him. I followed you to the cafe. I saw you with him. I read the emails. So I'll ask you again, who is Oliver?" Her face went pale, and for a moment she looked as though she might faint. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence was deafening. "James," she finally managed, her voice trembling, "I don't know what you think you saw, but—" "Stop lying," James interrupted, his voice rising. "I know everything, Eleanor. The emails, the weekend getaway, the little meetings at the cafe. How long has this been going on?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head as though trying to deny reality. "It's not what you think," she said weakly. "He's just a friend." James laughed bitterly, the sound filled with pain and anger. "A friend? Is that what friends do, Eleanor? Plan romantic weekends together? Share intimate messages? Tell me, did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I was so blind, so stupid that I wouldn't figure it out?" Eleanor's composure shattered. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "I was lonely, James. You were always working, always so distant. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore." James's chest tightened with a mixture of guilt and fury. "So this is my fault?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "You're blaming me for your betrayal?" I worked hard to give you everything, Eleanor. I supported you when you left your job, when you wanted to write your memoir. And this is how you repay me? I didn't plan it, Eleanor said, her voice cracking. It just happened. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. And then Oliver, he listened to me. He made me feel seen. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair. Seen? He repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. You felt seen by him, so you decided to throw away 30 years of marriage? Did you even think about what this would do to me? To our family? Eleanor's tears fell freely now, her face a picture of regret. I was wrong, she said, her voice barely audible. I know I was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, but please, James, don't give up on us. James stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hard. You gave up on us the moment you decided to lie. You had a choice, Eleanor, and you chose to betray me. There's no coming back from that. For a moment they stared at each other, the weight of 30 years of love, pain, and shared history hanging between them. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but James raised a hand, cutting her off. I want you to leave, he said, his voice cold and final. Pack your things and go. You can stay with Oliver or whoever else you want, but you're not staying here. Eleanor's face crumpled, and she shook her head desperately. Please, James, she pleaded, don't do this. Let's try to fix it. Let's go to counseling, anything, just don't end it like this. James's jaw tightened, his resolve unshaken. It ended the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you, he said. Now leave. Eleanor sobbed openly, but she didn't argue. She rose from her seat and walked slowly toward the stairs, her steps heavy with defeat. James watched her go, his chest aching with a pain so profound it felt like he was being torn in two. When he was alone, James sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. The house felt unbearably quiet, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. He reached for his glass of wine and took a long sip, the bitterness matching the turmoil in his heart. As the hours passed, James replayed the confrontation in his mind, questioning every word, every decision. But no matter how much he second-guessed himself, one thing remained clear. Eleanor's betrayal had changed everything. There was no going back. The sharp morning air greeted James as he stepped out of his car, his breath visible in the cold. The address he had pulled from Eleanor's emails matched the modest but well-maintained office building in front of him. Oliver's law firm was emblazoned on a polished plaque by the entrance, a name that now symbolized betrayal and upheaval in James's life. This was no spur-of-the-moment decision. James had spent days planning his next move. He wasn't just going to confront Oliver, he was going to dismantle the illusion of power and control this man had over his life. As James entered the building, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. There was no room for hesitation now. The receptionist, a young woman with a polite but distant demeanor, looked up as he approached. Good morning. Do you have an appointment? I'm here to see Oliver Parker, James replied, his voice calm but firm. Tell him it's urgent. The receptionist hesitated, eyeing James carefully before picking up the phone. A brief, hushed conversation followed, and she motioned toward a small seating area. Please have a seat. He'll be out shortly. James sat, his eyes fixed on the frosted glass door that led to Oliver's office. His mind raced with thoughts of what he would say, how he would deliver the blows he had meticulously prepared. This wasn't just about Eleanor's betrayal, it was about reclaiming his dignity, about showing Oliver that he wasn't the weak, oblivious husband he might have assumed. The door opened and Oliver stepped out. He was every bit as James had imagined, tall, impeccably dressed, with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His smile faded as his eyes met James's, recognition flashing across his face. James, isn't it? Oliver said, extending a hand that James pointedly ignored. What brings you here? Let's talk, James said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Oliver gestured toward his office and James followed him inside. The room was tastefully decorated, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city skyline. Oliver closed the door behind them and motioned for James to sit. I assume this is about Eleanor, Oliver said, leaning against his desk with a casual air that made James's blood boil. James didn't sit. Instead, he pulled a folder from his bag and placed it on the desk. You've been busy, he said, his voice low and controlled. Emails, text messages, receipts, quite a paper trail you've left. Oliver's smirk faltered. Look, I know this is a difficult situation. Don't patronize me, James interrupted, his voice sharp. You don't get to play the understanding third party when you've been sneaking around with another man's wife. Oliver straightened, his confident facade slipping. James, whatever issues you have with Eleanor are between you two. I didn't force her into anything. James's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. You're right, he said. You didn't force her. But you're a willing participant, and now you're going to face the consequences. Oliver's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? James opened the folder, revealing documents he had painstakingly gathered over the past few days. They weren't just receipts and emails. They included financial records, evidence of questionable transactions, and a list of professional ethics violations that James had uncovered through a private investigator. You're not just a cheater, Oliver, James said, his voice cold. You're a fraud. These transactions? They're enough to open an investigation into your firm. I wonder how your clients would feel knowing their lawyer can't keep his personal or professional life in order. Oliver's face turned ashen. He reached for the documents, but James slammed his hand down on them, stopping him. Don't bother, James said. I have copies. You can't do this, Oliver said, his voice wavering. This is blackmail? James smiled for the first time, a cold, humorless expression. No, Oliver. This is justice. You thought you could play games with my life, my marriage, and walk away unscathed? Think again. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Oliver seemed to struggle for words, his confident demeanor completely shattered. What do you want? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James stepped back, crossing his arms. It's simple. You end whatever this is with Eleanor. You stay out of my life, my family's life, and you clean up your act before I decide to send these documents to the Bar Association and every client you've ever worked with. Oliver nodded quickly, desperation etched into his features. Fine. Consider it done. James leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And one more thing. If I ever see you near Eleanor again, you'll regret it. That's not a threat, it's a promise. Oliver swallowed hard, nodding again. Understood. James turned and walked toward the door, but before he left, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. Enjoy the rest of your day, Oliver, he said, the sarcasm in his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. As James stepped back into the crisp air outside, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The confrontation had been painful, but it was also empowering. He had taken control, delivered the message he needed to, and left no room for ambiguity. For the first time in weeks, James felt a flicker of hope. He couldn't undo the past, but he could take steps to rebuild his future. One where he wasn't a victim but a man who refused to be broken. Eleanor's world began to unravel slowly at first, like a loose thread pulled from a once pristine tapestry. The cracks in her facade grew more visible each day after James demanded she leave the house. She packed her bags with trembling hands, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her like a physical force. The spacious, beautifully decorated home that had once been her sanctuary now felt alien, hostile even. Every corner of the house echoed with memories of a life she had destroyed. She moved in with a friend temporarily, though it was clear the arrangement wasn't ideal. The guest room was cramped, the walls bare, and the air carried an awkward tension. Eleanor knew her friend had questions she was too polite to ask, and Eleanor lacked the courage to volunteer the truth. At first, she tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, throwing herself into her writing and frequenting the gym as she had before. But the weight of her guilt and the whispers of gossip began to follow her wherever she went. The cafe where she had once met Oliver now felt suffocating, its regular patrons offering sidelong glances and hushed conversations. It seemed the news of her betrayal had traveled faster than she had anticipated. The first real blow came when she checked her bank account one morning, only to find it nearly empty. James had frozen their joint accounts, a move that caught her completely off guard. Her credit cards were declined at the grocery store later that day, the cashier's apologetic tone doing little to quell the humiliation that burned in her cheeks. She had always prided herself on her independence, but now she felt powerless, reduced to borrowing money from her friend just to get by. Eleanor tried to reach out to James, leaving him voicemails and sending long, heartfelt emails. She poured her soul into those messages, apologizing, begging for forgiveness, and asking for a chance to explain. But James remained silent, his resolve unyielding. Each unanswered plea was another dagger to her heart, a painful reminder of how far she had fallen. Her desperation grew as her situation worsened. She reached out to Oliver, hoping for comfort or support, but his responses were curt and distant. The charming, attentive man she had once confided in now seemed like a stranger. He made excuses, citing work and personal obligations, and eventually stopped replying altogether. The reality hit her like a freight train. She had sacrificed everything for a relationship that was as fragile as it was fleeting. The second blow came when her publisher emailed to inform her that they were putting her memoir project on hold. "Given recent developments, we feel it's best to reassess our partnership," the email read. The vague wording did little to mask the truth. Her personal scandal had tarnished her reputation. She had been a respected figure in her social and professional circles, but now she was seen as a cautionary tale, a symbol of betrayal and poor judgment. Eleanor's isolation deepened. Friends who had once admired her and sought her advice now avoided her. Invitations to social gatherings ceased, and even her gym sessions became a minefield of awkward encounters. She could feel the weight of judgmental stares and hear the thinly veiled whispers as she walked by. One day she mustered the courage to call Sophie, her daughter, hoping for a glimmer of solace. But Sophie's voice on the other end of the line was cold and distant. "Mom," Sophie said, "I don't know what to say to you. Dad's been through hell and I can't just ignore that." Eleanor's voice broke as she tried to explain. "I made a mistake, Sophie. I know I hurt your father, but I'm still your mother." There was a long pause before Sophie replied, her tone laced with disappointment. "You didn't just hurt Dad. You hurt all of us. I need time to process this." The call ended, leaving Eleanor feeling more alone than ever. She wanted to reach out to Michael, but she couldn't bear the thought of hearing the same pain in his voice. The distance between her and her children felt insurmountable, a chasm she wasn't sure she could ever bridge. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor's desperation gave way to introspection. She began to see the ripple effects of her actions more clearly, the trust she had shattered, the relationships she had strained, and the pain she had inflicted on the man who had loved her for 30 years. Her regret was palpable, but it was tinged with a helplessness that came from knowing it might be too late to make amends. Her once vibrant life had shrunk to a shadow of what it had been. The accolades, the admiration, the stability, all of it had slipped through her fingers. Eleanor found herself sitting alone in the guest room late at night, staring at the blank pages of her notebook. The words wouldn't come, the stories she had once been so eager to tell now felt hollow and meaningless. One evening, as she scrolled through old photos on her phone, she stumbled upon a picture of her and James on their 20th wedding anniversary. They were smiling, their arms wrapped around each other, with a sunset painting the sky behind them. The memory hit her like a wave, and for the first time in weeks, Eleanor allowed herself to cry openly. The tears weren't just for what she had lost. They were for what she had taken for granted, for the choices that had led her to this point. Despite her regret, Eleanor knew that sympathy alone wouldn't repair the damage she had done. She began to take small steps toward redemption, not because she believed she could win James back, but because she wanted to be a better person for herself. She started volunteering at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others even as she struggled to rebuild her own life. But James's resolve remained firm. He had moved on, focusing on his work, his children, and his own healing. The house, once filled with the echoes of their shared life, now felt lighter, freer. Eleanor's downfall served as a painful reminder of the consequences of betrayal, but for James, it was also a testament to his own strength and resilience. Eleanor's life had become a patchwork of loss and reflection, a stark contrast to the stable, vibrant existence she had once known. The isolation, the financial strain, and the broken relationships were a constant reminder of the cost of her choices. She had lost everything, and while she held on to a sliver of hope for redemption, she knew that some wounds could never fully heal. James stood at the edge of his backyard, the cool morning breeze brushing against his face as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the freshly trimmed lawn. The air was crisp, filled with the promise of a new beginning. For the first time in months, James felt a semblance of peace, not complete, but enough to remind him that life, even fractured, could be rebuilt. In the weeks following Eleanor's departure, James had thrown himself into his work. His consulting business, once a stable but uninspired routine, had become his lifeline. He found himself tackling challenges with a renewed vigor, taking on projects that pushed his limits and demanded his focus. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Clients praised his dedication, and new opportunities began pouring in. "James, your work is nothing short of remarkable," a longtime client remarked during a video call. "Your insights have turned our quarter around. I'd like to bring you on board for a larger project." "Thank you," James replied, his voice steady but humble. "I appreciate the trust." But work was only one part of his healing. James knew he couldn't rely solely on professional success to fill the void left by Eleanor's betrayal. He began reaching out to old friends, rekindling connections that had faded over the years. Friday nights that had once been spent in quiet solitude were now filled with laughter and camaraderie at his favorite pub. It wasn't just the distraction he needed, it was a reminder that his world hadn't ended. One evening at a networking event, James met Victoria. She was a marketing consultant, sharp-witted and grounded, with a smile that lit up the room. Their initial conversation was purely professional, but as the evening progressed, James found himself drawn to her energy. "Do you always ask this many questions?" James teased after Victoria had peppered him with inquiries about his career. "Only when I find the answers interesting," she replied with a sly grin. Their exchanges were light-hearted, but beneath the surface, James felt a spark he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't ready to call it anything more than a connection, but it was enough to remind him that his life wasn't defined by the past. As James worked on rebuilding his personal and professional life, he also began addressing the emotional scars Eleanor had left behind. Therapy sessions became a regular part of his routine, providing a safe space to confront his anger, sadness, and lingering questions. "You've come a long way," his therapist observed one afternoon. "But healing isn't just about moving forward. It's about finding purpose in the pain." Those words resonated deeply with James. He started volunteering at a local mentorship program, helping young professionals navigate the challenges of their careers. Guiding others gave him a sense of fulfillment that no amount of business success could replicate. During one such session, a mentee asked him, "How do you bounce back from failure? From something that feels like it's broken you?" James paused, the weight of the question settling over him. Then, with a steady voice, he replied, "You remind yourself that failure isn't the end. It's a chapter, not the whole story. And sometimes, the broken pieces come together to create something stronger." The mentee nodded, and James realized that his words weren't just for them. They were for himself too. Back at home, the house felt different. It was no longer a place filled with echoes of Eleanor's betrayal, but a sanctuary he was reshaping to reflect his new life. He replaced the old dining set with a sleek, modern table and filled the walls with photographs of his children and landscapes from his travels. Each change was a step toward reclaiming his space and his identity. One evening as James cooked dinner, the phone rang. It was Sophie. "Dad?" she said hesitantly. "I just wanted to check in." James set down the spatula, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I'm glad you called, sophomore. How are you?" They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation flowing easily. It was the kind of connection James had feared he'd lost forever in the aftermath of Eleanor's actions. By the end of the call, Sophie said something that stayed with him. "You've always been the strong one, Dad," she said. "And I think you're even stronger now." Those words became a mantra for James, a reminder of his resilience and the progress he had made. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving piece by piece, day by day. One afternoon, while sorting through old documents, James came across a handwritten letter from Eleanor. It had arrived weeks earlier, but he hadn't had the courage to read it until now. Her words were filled with regret, apologies, and pleas for forgiveness. "I know I can't undo the pain I caused," she wrote. "But I hope you can find it in your heart to remember the good times we shared." James folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. He wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet and perhaps not ever. But he no longer felt consumed by anger. Eleanor's choices had been hers, and while they had caused him pain, they didn't define him. Standing in his backyard that evening, James looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past begin to lift. Life wasn't perfect and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time he felt hopeful. With a small smile, he whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." And it was. The courthouse loomed in the distance, a stark, imposing structure against the pale morning sky. James gripped the handle of his briefcase tightly as he approached the entrance. Today marked the culmination of months of preparation, countless sleepless nights, and an emotional journey he never thought he'd endure. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reckoning, a moment to reclaim his life and deliver justice. Inside, the sterile hum of the courthouse filled the air. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks hurried between rooms, and the faint echo of heels against marble floors reminded James of the gravity of what was about to transpire. He spotted Eleanor sitting at the far end of the hallway with her lawyer. She looked subdued, her usually vibrant demeanor dimmed. Their eyes met briefly, and for a fleeting moment, James thought he saw regret in her expression. But it was too late for second thoughts. Her betrayal had drawn a line he could not cross. James's lawyer, Clara, arrived moments later, her confident stride and no-nonsense attitude immediately reassuring. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, glancing at him with sharp eyes. "I've been ready for months," James replied, his voice steady but low. Clara nodded, gesturing for him to follow her. "Good. Let's remind them that actions have consequences." As they entered the courtroom, James felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Anger, determination, and a bittersweet sense of finality. He took his seat, his gaze fixed firmly on the judge's bench. Eleanor sat across from him, her posture tense, her lawyer whispering hurried instructions into her ear. James had no intention of looking away or showing weakness. This was his moment to take control of the narrative. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Clara presented James's case with precision, detailing Eleanor's infidelity and the financial mismanagement that had come to light during their separation. Emails, text messages, and receipts were submitted as evidence, each item further solidifying the betrayal. The room felt heavy with tension as every detail was laid bare. "Your Honor," Clara said, her voice calm but commanding, "my client gave 30 years of his life to this marriage. He provided stability, love, and trust that was repeatedly violated. We're not just asking for a divorce settlement, we're asking for justice." Eleanor's lawyer attempted to counter, painting her as a woman who had made a mistake but was seeking redemption. "Miss Sinclair deeply regrets her actions," he argued. "This is not a case of malicious intent but one of human error. She has expressed a desire to reconcile and should not be punished for her remorse." Clara, unshaken, stood to rebut. "Remorse is meaningless without accountability," she said sharply. "My client isn't here to debate emotions. He's here because the facts are undeniable. Miss Sinclair's choices have had real, tangible consequences, and it's only fair that she faces them." The turning point came when Eleanor took the stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted her version of events, an attempt to frame herself as a victim of circumstance. "I was lonely," she said, tears streaming down her face. "James was always working, always distant. I didn't know how to reach him anymore." James's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his emotions roiling beneath the surface. When Clara cross-examined Eleanor, her questions were merciless. "You claim loneliness drove your actions," Clara began, her tone cold. "But is it not true that you chose to lie repeatedly even when confronted with the truth? That you spent joint funds on personal indulgences while hiding your actions from your husband?" Eleanor faltered, her tears turning into quiet sobs. "I wasn't thinking clearly," she said weakly. "No further questions," Clara said, her voice like steel. She returned to her seat, satisfaction evident in her demeanor. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, James felt his chest tighten. Based on the evidence presented, the judge said, "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The divorce is granted, with the financial settlement heavily favoring Mr. Sinclair. Additionally, Miss Sinclair is to vacate the shared property immediately." James exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling over him. This was more than a legal victory, it was the closure he had been fighting for. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor approached him hesitantly. "James," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. For everything." James studied her for a moment, his emotions a complex web of anger, sadness, and something close to pity. "Eleanor," he said firmly, "I spent years loving you, trusting you, and building a life with you. You threw that away. I hope you find peace, but I can't give it to you." He turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in his heart. Later that evening, James drove to the family's vacation cabin. a place that had once been a haven of happiness but now felt tainted by the past. He had decided to sell it, unable to bear the weight of the memories it held. Standing outside, he took one last look at the structure, its wooden beams catching the golden light of the setting sun. Inside, he gathered the remnants of their shared life, photo albums, old furniture, and trinkets Eleanor had insisted on keeping there. With the help of a few workers, he loaded everything into a burn pile. The air was filled with the scent of wood and paper as the flames roared to life. "Let it burn," he said softly, watching the fire consume the physical symbols of a broken marriage. The flames danced wildly, illuminating his face as he stood silently, the heat pressing against his skin. The next morning, James signed the final paperwork to sell the property. The proceeds went into a trust fund he had created for his children and a new charitable initiative, scholarships for young students in need. It was his way of turning pain into purpose, of ensuring that something good came from the ashes of his past. Back at home, James sat in his newly renovated living room, a glass of wine in hand. The house, once filled with tension and unease, now felt like a sanctuary. The walls were adorned with photos of his children, landscapes from his travels, and artwork he had picked out himself. It was a space that reflected who he was, a man who had endured, grown, and emerged stronger. His phone buzzed and he smiled when he saw the caller ID. It was Victoria. Their relationship had grown slowly but steadily, each conversation filled with laughter and understanding. "How does it feel?" she asked when he answered. "To finally close the book?" James replied. "It feels liberating." "I'm glad," Victoria said warmly. "Maybe now we can talk about that trip to the coast we've been planning." James chuckled, a genuine laugh that felt foreign but welcome. "I think it's about time," he said. As he hung up, James stepped outside onto his patio. The evening sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop for the sense of peace that had finally settled within him. He raised his glass to the horizon, his voice steady and filled with resolve. "To new beginnings," he said aloud. This was his victory, not just over Eleanor or the pain she had caused, but over the doubts and fears that had once consumed him. James was no longer a man defined by betrayal but by resilience, strength, and a determination to move forward. James stood on the edge of his patio, gazing at the sprawling horizon. The evening sky painted a masterpiece of vibrant orange and soft purple hues, blending seamlessly with the calm stillness of his newly renovated home. The silence was no longer heavy, it was comforting, a reminder of his journey from chaos to clarity. Months had passed since the courtroom victory that marked the official end of his marriage. The legal battles were over, and the emotional scars, though still visible, were healing. James found himself reflecting on the whirlwind that had been his life, a tapestry of love, betrayal, pain, and ultimately redemption. Lessons in trust. James poured himself a glass of wine and sank into his favorite armchair, the leather cool against his skin. On the side table sat a worn notebook filled with scribbled thoughts and reflections from his late-night musings. Picking it up, he flipped to a page he had written shortly after the court ruling. "Trust is the foundation of love. Once shattered, it takes more than time to rebuild. It takes effort, honesty, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths." The words resonated deeply. Trust had been the cornerstone of his relationship with Eleanor, and when it crumbled, it revealed just how fragile their foundation had become. Yet he realized that while Eleanor had failed him, it didn't mean everyone would. Trust wasn't just about others, it was about trusting himself again, his instincts, his resilience. He ran his fingers over the notebook's cover, his mind wandering to the many sleepless nights he had spent questioning everything. Had he been too focused on work? Too complacent in his marriage? Too blind to the signs? While he couldn't rewrite the past, he could learn from it. Reclaiming purpose. The last few months had been transformative, both personally and professionally. James had expanded his consulting business, taking on larger, more meaningful projects that challenged and inspired him. One particular venture, a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs, had become his passion. Standing before a room of eager minds during a recent workshop, James had posed a question that had silenced the crowd. What defines you, the setbacks you face or how you rise from them? The answers varied, but they were thoughtful, introspective. As he listened to their responses, James couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He wasn't just teaching them about business, He was teaching them about life, about resilience, about finding strength in adversity. One mentee, a young woman named Clara, had approached him after the session. "Your story inspires me," she said earnestly. "You don't just talk about resilience, you embody it." Her words stayed with him, a testament to how far he had come. For so long, James had seen himself as a victim of Eleanor's betrayal. Now he saw himself as a survivor, a builder of new dreams. A symbolic end. The vacation cabin was gone now, sold to a young couple starting their own journey together. James had deliberately chosen them as the buyers, finding solace in the idea that the place once steeped in painful memories could now foster joy and love. The final act of closure had been cathartic. Watching the cabin stripped of its contents, James had decided to burn what he no longer needed: photographs, furniture, and remnants of a life he had left behind. Standing by the roaring flames, he had felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. "I'm done carrying this weight," he had whispered to himself, the words carried away by the crackling fire. The proceeds from the sale had been used to fund a scholarship program in his mother's name, a cause close to his heart. Turning something painful into something purposeful was the most meaningful way James could imagine honoring his past while looking forward to his future. New connections. James's phone buzzed on the side table, pulling him from his thoughts. The screen lit up with Victoria's name. Their connection had grown steadily over the past few months, a mix of friendship, understanding, and a slow-burning romance. She was unlike anyone he had met, honest, grounded, and fiercely independent. "Hey," she said warmly when he answered. "I was just thinking about you." "That's a coincidence," James replied with a soft chuckle. "I was just thinking about me too." Victoria laughed, a sound James had grown to cherish. "How does it feel being a free man with the world at your feet?" "Strange," James admitted. "But good. Really good." "Good enough to finally take that trip to the coast?" she teased. James smiled, picturing her grin on the other end of the line. "I think I've earned it." "Then it's a date," she said. "We'll toast to new beginnings." As he ended the call, James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with possibilities. For so long, his focus had been on survival, on clawing his way out of the darkness. Now he was finally ready to embrace the light. A thoughtful pause. Later that night, as James stood on the patio, the cool breeze brushing against his face, he allowed himself to reflect on the lessons of the past year. Betrayal had shaken him to his core, but it had also revealed his strength. Pain had been his teacher, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths and emerge wiser. He thought about trust, about the fragility of human relationships, and about the importance of self-worth. He had learned that his happiness didn't depend on anyone else, not Eleanor, not Victoria, not even his children. It came from within, from living a life aligned with his values. "Would I change it?" he asked aloud, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. The answer was complicated. He wouldn't wish the pain on anyone, but he also recognized that it had shaped him into the man he was now. A question for the future. James raised his glass to the night sky, the stars twinkling like tiny beacons of hope. "To moving forward," he said softly. "To building something better." He wondered if others, faced with the same betrayal, would have made the same choices. Would they forgive? Would they hold on to the past or let it go? He posed the question to himself, but also to anyone who might someday hear his story. "What would you do?" he asked the universe, his voice steady. "Would you forgive or would you move on?" The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of possibility. James's life was far from perfect, but it was his. He had faced the storm, endured its wrath, and emerged stronger. The future stretched out before him, unknown but inviting, and he was ready to embrace it. This was his story, not of betrayal but of resilience, growth, and the power of starting over.